after Columbine, after Sandy Hook, after Charleston, after Orlando, after Las Vegas, after Parkland, nothing has been done. This time that can't be true. This time we must actually do something. We need to ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. This week, mass shootings in America. Another in Tulsa, Oklahoma. A man in pain over a back operation shoots his doctor and 3 more people. Again, an AR-15 assault rifle bought 3 hours before the shooting. Same rifle in the school shooting in Texas used to kill 19 children. In 1994, President Bill Clinton signed an assault weapons ban, which actually banned the AR-15 and other similar semi-automatic rifles. After its ban, mass shootings were down in the decade that followed, but the ban on assault weapons expired after 10 years. We talked to former NYPD Police Lieutenant Darrin Porcher on police practices and weapons and more. And the war in Ukraine. It's now 100 days of ruinous, barbaric attacks by Russian forces on Ukrainian population centers. Millions of people displaced. The world's food supply is in danger. And no end in sight to Putin's war on his neighbor. All right, Malcolm Davis is a senior analyst on defense strategy and capability at ASPI, which is the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Thank you, Dr. Davis, for talking to us about Ukraine and what's happening on the ground there. Do you get a sense from what you're able to read, from what you're able to see, and can you see through some of the smoke on the battlefield? And do you feel that Russia is progressing or Russia is stalled?
Look, I think that the picture is uneven, but certainly the indications are that the Russians have learned a lot of lessons from their past failure in the first phase of the war, where they tried to essentially do a coup de main and capture Kiev. That failed miserably because they threw out the lessons of combined armed operations and left their logistics train behind and didn't support their ground forces with air power. They did everything wrong, basically, in that first phase. So they've gone back. They're now focusing very much on the Donbass region around Severodonetsk, with the aim being to capture that, and then Kramatorsk. And I think they are learning. They're adapting. They're starting to make progress and starting to gain momentum. Now, whether they can sustain that momentum in a manner that enables them to continue to advance and capture Kramatorsk, to essentially encircle the Ukrainian forces that are extended way forward in a salient towards Severodonetsk, is the key question. If they can do that, if they can encircle those Ukrainian forces and ultimately wear them down in the same way that they wore down the defenders in Mariupol in the south, then they have a significant victory on their hands. But the question is, can they do that? Do they have the material that is effective? Is the morale good enough, or is it going to stall? If it stalls, then we're into a stagnant stalemate.
None of this is good news for Ukraine right now, which continues to receive weapon shipments from the West. Much is being made about some of these multiple launch rocket systems that President Biden has promised them that give them increased range of 50 miles. So those weapon shipments are helping them hold on, but they don't seem to be turning the battle right now.
Well, there's only 4 HIMARS batteries that the Ukrainians are getting. They're getting the M270 rockets, which have about a 70-kilometer range. So they're not the long-range ATACMS missiles. They obviously are fighting very well. I think they've absolutely shamed the Russians in terms of demonstrating how effective the Ukrainians really are. But whether it's enough to actually beat back the Russians to the extent that they're imposing a decisive and visible defeat on the Russians in the breadth and length of Ukraine is another question. And really, that's what's needed. We need to impose a decisive defeat on Russia. Now, of course, the risks.
So then how do you do that, if I can jump in there? Because if you're saying the existing weapon shipments haven't done the trick, it sounds like they're going to have to do more.
You're going to need greater numbers of weapons from the West in greater quantities, with greater emphasis on long-range firepower, heavier weapon systems. In other words, javelins alone aren't enough. We need more emphasis on long-range firepower, greater emphasis on the Ukrainians acquiring armored forces and drones and surveillance capabilities to identify locations where the Russians are and strike at those locations. So my point is that the Western liberal democracies really need to step up to the plate and start accelerating and broadening the delivery of material military support to the Ukrainians.
They would say they've already done that, and yet it doesn't appear to change the battlefield that much.
They would, but I think they could do a lot more. I'm certainly not advocating, a no-fly zone or anything like that, but I think that Western democracies, particularly the NATO states and the European states, need to do a lot more. Germany, in particular, needs to do a lot more. And I think that once you start flowing those material supplies to the Ukrainians in depth and breadth, then you start to change the indicators on the ground. The Russians, which are suffering from fragmented, broken forces as a result of the first phase of the war, will find it less easy to compete and reconstitute. And so their position then starts to look very precarious.
Would you hazard to make a guess on how long this is going to go?
I think this is going to go for several months. This is not going to be over anytime soon. I think that we could still be having this discussion this time next year and it'll still be going. Now, of course, the risk is that the longer it goes on, a number of things could happen. Firstly, as more weapons flow into Ukraine from the West, Russia could decide to escalate and attack those supply lines directly in NATO, and that leads to a wider war between NATO and Russia. Secondly, if the Russians begin really losing badly, they could escalate to either chemical weapons use or even a tactical nuclear weapon use as part of escalate to de-escalate. That's a scenario that I think everyone is very conscious of. There's also a third scenario of the West having to do something to open up the supply of wheat out of the southern coast to world markets, because Russia...
You said you wouldn't advocate a no-fly zone. Would you advocate some kind of UN or even NATO force to open up those sea lanes out of Odessa?
That's certainly something that's being considered. And I think that if we don't do something like that, then the world is going to face a very serious food shortage. And Russia understands this, and it's ruthlessly exploiting that in the hope, I think, of trying to convince the West to convince Ukraine to accept a settlement that makes it surrender territory, sort of thing that Kissinger was talking about a few weeks back. We shouldn't play into that game. I do think we need to force open those sea lanes and open those coasts. Now, the risk is, of course, that if we do that, the Russians could decide to intervene against us. But they have to understand that if they do that, if there's direct conflict between NATO and Russia at sea in the Black Sea, then the risks of escalation, are just as bad for them as they are for us. And so they lose as well. So one would hope
you're not the first person to tell me that. And I've heard it from there is obviously a very large international conversation that's taking place, which advocates, and very quickly, opening up those sea lanes, whether Russia will negotiate it or whether Russia wants it or not, because you have the new harvest. The old harvest is sitting in silos. The new harvest, within a matter of weeks, should be making its way to Mariupol. They cannot move enough of that over rail through Poland. They've got to rely on those sea routes. So, amongst your colleagues, and I know you talk to people around the world, do you think that there is real international traction now on forcing the Black Sea issue and removing Russia's blockade?
Well, I think the risk is that if we don't, then you are going to see global food shortages that could lead to millions of people dying, across the world in third world countries. So how do we sort of balance the risk of an operation at sea to open those sea lanes and those ports, knowing that it could see potential for direct clash between, say, for example, a UN naval force and Russia, versus the risk of, or the certainty of, a global food crisis that could last months and lead to many deaths. It's a really difficult call because obviously any direct clash could lead to a wider war with obvious implications of escalation to nuclear weapons. But if we don't, then we have a really serious global food crisis that could last many months and not get any better, because the Russians are not going to willingly give up that south coast. So I'm not sure there's an easy answer to this one.
Can I, as a last question, ask you, what do you think victory looks like for President Putin right now? Do you think that he would be content biting off a big part of eastern Ukraine, this land bridge to the Crimea, and stopping short of Odessa and not circling around and reattacking Kiev? Or do you think it's really a question of time and what they're able to accomplish on the ground?
I think from Putin's perspective, he still wants all of Ukraine. So his initial theory of victory will be controlling the Donbass and the south coast, and basically getting Ukraine to accept that, as well as neutrality. But then down the track, once Russia has reformed its military capability and rebuilt those forces, he'll launch another war to take Kiev. I don't think he's going to be sated simply by the Donbass and the south coast. So we are facing the prospect of an ongoing threat here. It's not going to go away. And I think this is why it's really a bad move on the part of the West if we essentially give Russia the Donbass and the south coast to try and, let's put it bluntly, ensure peace in our time.
All the more reason that you hear people like President Biden say that they're not going to impose terms and conditions on Ukraine. In the end, it will be up to Ukraine to accept what they will take at the negotiating table or what they won't. And obviously, Ukraine is probably not going to accept allowing Russia to occupy and claim all of that territory of eastern Ukraine.
Right. So the challenge we face then is, how do we impose a defeat on Russia to deter them from doing this again in the future, without risking Putin reaching for escalate to de-escalate with a tactical nuclear weapon, or going with attacks on NATO directly? That's the challenge we face in the coming months, is how, if we're supplying the Ukrainians and we're standing with them to ensure that they can defeat the Russian forces on the ground, the risk is that, once it becomes clear to Russia that they are losing and losing badly, Putin may escalate. So how we avoid that whilst imposing a defeat is the real challenge for the West. And I'm not sure, to be honest, it's a possible outcome that we're going to achieve.
Malcolm Davis, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Malcolm, thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
All right, Dr. Darrin Porcher is a criminal justice expert and a former NYPD officer, and he joins us now from New York. Hi, Darrin.
Hello, Dana. Thanks for having me as a guest.
Thank you, sir. And it's good to talk to you again. Look, in my days as a crime reporter, and I think the first year there were about 450 gun calls, as we used to call them in Toronto. And that was where the police had any report of a gun at all, and they responded. And then the ETF, which was that's Toronto's version of the emergency task force, the SWAT team, was called in. Police would stand back. The SWAT team would take up their positions, get set, establish contact with whoever was in that house or that building. Negotiations would begin, and slowly they would decide whether they were going to enter the property or not. This is a very long question. Excuse me for that. But that was in the 1980s, and things were supposed to have changed. What happened in Texas?
When we look at the natural order of policing, more so specific to the operations component, in the past, the special operations officers were the individuals that were tasked to interdict I want to say either barricaded suspects or someone that is embarking upon a mass shooting. And so we refer to this as an active shooter, so to speak. However, in the 1990s, after the Columbine massacre, there's been a seismic shift in policing in connection with the response of the first responding officer, that being the person that's now tasked with interdicting the shooter. So when we fast forward to the recent occurrence as to what happened down in Texas, the responding officers did come in and there was somewhat of a layover, so to speak. When I say a layover, meaning the officers maintained a position of pause and they awaited the additional response of special operations officers, as you may refer to them as SWAT. But that took far too long. The officers waited for over an hour before they went in to breach the door, and what it resulted in was an extremely high level of casualties to children that were as young as 9, 10, and 11 years old. So it begs the question of what was the plausible strategy that was introduced by that department in Texas? What could have been better? And what went far worse? And this is where we have an after action review, and we have critical components in history that reflect on what happened with the Nicholas Cruz shooting in Parkland in Florida a couple of years ago. Gross similarities, and hopefully law enforcement in the United States can reevaluate this and develop a plan to ensure something like this doesn't happen in the future.
All right. So, I mean, this is an act of, as far as I'm concerned, domestic terror. You can call it whatever you want to. Here in the UK, you agree. Here in the UK, they've rehearsed terror incidents, and now the drill is step over the wounded. Like, don't even deal with the wounded on the exterior of the building or just inside. You go for the gun. You go for the shooter. And that it was supposed to have happened in Texas as well.
I wholeheartedly agree that this was the time that we needed to interdict the threat and terminate his assault on innocent young children. However, it didn't happen. So it begs the question of, there's been one side of the argument that states that the officers were given a command from the higher authority that this was now a barricaded suspect and no longer an active shooter. If that occurred, it was grossly inaccurate, and that was a false narrative, and the officers should have done something different.
Even if it was, at that point, a contained situation in the sense that, you know, let's say he was not firing any more shots, which I understand he did fire some more shots, but even if it was a barricaded suspect at that point, they already knew or should have known they had a lot of wounded people in there. And as those precious seconds and minutes ticked by, children probably died.
It's a very unfortunate situation. And unfortunately, what you're saying, Dana, is accurate. So it begs the question of, what was the competence or the moral compass of the police commanders on the scene that were controlling that incident? And it was clear that it was a flawed strategy, which resulted in the death of innocent kids.
In the US, is it complicated in the sense there's an extra layer? Because if something happens here in London, the London Met are in charge, and whatever senior officer arrives on the scene takes command and gets on with it. But here you had a small town, and then you had larger regional police forces responding and state police responding, and the command structure and who pushes the launch button on a breach that barricaded suspect and get in there becomes a big question mark and becomes confusing.
Well, not really. I can understand it from the external perspective of viewing this, but internally, traditionally, it's always the local police that are responsible for making that decision. Here we had an instance of local police officers that were accompanied by Border Patrol agents, and it was actually a Border Patrol officer that shot and killed the suspect. In addition to that, you had state police, the Texas Department of Public safety that were also a part of the equation. But the reason why we rely upon local police is because they have a better understanding of the landscape as to who the parties involved are and what the schematic of that building would be. That's why we oftentimes lend deference to the local police department. When we have a prolonged incident, that's when we'll have an incident command post that would be established and an incident commander would be erected based on that command post structure. But oftentimes when we have a continuous event such as what we saw, it's the local police department that's at the forefront.
Local police department armed with what?
Well, in Texas, you have a local police department that's armed with long guns, automatic weapons, and things to that effect, because you have a very gun-happy culture in Texas. So you're going to have the armaments, although it was a small department, but that department was equipped with the necessary resources. And it just didn't, or the plan of execution in accordance with what it should have been.
So you don't think they stood back and stood down or waited for more serious equipped police to arrive based on the fact that they were wearing like sidearms, they had handguns? You think they actually probably did have the weapons they needed to go in and take on a guy with 2 AR-15s?
Absolutely. In a place like Texas, all of those small town police officers not only have sidearms, but they have long guns. Texas is one of those states where it's a gun culture that affords police as well as citizens these long guns. So you had responding officers that from that small town of Uvalde that were in possession of long guns.
So look, I know you're from the NYPD originally, but you're a pretty national guy when it comes to policing issues on weapons and how police generally line up across the country. Now I've put you on the spot, so you're going to have to do this. Do you think that when you look at public opinion in terms of policing opinion, that the police generally support these weapons in private hands, these assault rifles? Or do you think that the police kind of come together and say, why are we having to face down people in these incidents armed with these kinds of weapons? Do they want them off the street, these assault rifles?
Dana, that's a great question. Law enforcement is aligned with the Second Amendment, but at the same token, they are far or diametrically opposed to the public being in possession of these weapons, such as the AR design firearm that was used by the assailant in this particular case. Law enforcement are strong proponents of, if a person can pass a background check, it's okay for them to have certain weapons. However, there should be a prohibition on the weapons that the common citizen should be allowed to possess. And that's not the narrative that's being put out there. What you hear oftentimes is
so let me clarify that. So you're saying they support the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, but not assault rifles? Is that what you're saying?
Not just assault rifles. I mean, you're partially correct, but law enforcement is not in support of people being in possession of these assault weapons, nor are they in support of people that haven't passed a background check. Law enforcement are clearly supportive of gun control measures. That's something that's nationally accepted amongst police. However, you hear the extreme right that will focus on a platform of Second Amendment, and you have a right to maintain these weapons, which is diametrically opposed to the position of law enforcement.
Because nobody wants to face a person armed with multiple magazines and 2 AR-15s. No policeman wants to go and face that, right? I mean, that's not people. You're trained to do it, but I mean, that's a lot of firepower.
You're absolutely right, Dana. And it begs the question of, how is Congress managing this very slippery slope of gun control in the United States? I'm a firm proponent in this. There needs to be some gun control, but there are other things that I'm willing to accept. When I say some gun control, meaning there needs to be background checks, there needs to be people that are of mental health concern, if they are in possession of weapons, they need to be removed. We need to enforce the red flag laws. I don't think that there is a place in society for these weapons that exceed the firepower of police. And I'm not the only person that feels this way. If you speak to any law enforcement officer in the United States, they'll give you the same messaging.
How about age limitations? I mean, a lot of states do not allow 18-year-olds to go and buy those weapons.
Well, in the state of Texas, it's very unfortunate that this individual, 18, was allowed to acquire a weapon of this massive structure at 18 years old. I'm a former Texas resident, and I clearly know that it's an extreme gun culture in that particular state. And I think that there needs to be some revolutions in the gun laws. But on another point, handguns or sidearms, a person needs to be 21 and older to acquire those pistol from a gun dealer. However, that law does not prohibit the sale to a person that's under 21 to a third-party seller. And I give you an example. The next door neighbor has a gun that they want to sell. If you can arrange a sale between yourself and the next door neighbor and you're under 21, that's not an unlawful purchase.
Really?
I think that that's a loophole. Absolutely. That's a loophole that needs to stop. But you don't have the legislators that are willing to step up to the plate in the state of Texas and make that adjustment. And that's how we saw this manifest into the shooting that occurred in Uvalde.
Any idea why legislators don't want to step up? Because when you take a look at a lot of the polling, I mean, the New York Times had a pretty good piece just right after the shooting happened. And I was struck by, the debate just doesn't go right and left and divided down pro-gun and anti-gun. There's a lot of pro-gun people who support a lot of the amendments and proposals to restrict gun laws, but still satisfy Second Amendment appetite. You're
absolutely right, Dana. The gross majority of gun owners do support some level of gun control. And this is clearly an example of a situation where the gun control measures were not effective and more needed to be done. Now, I'm not this person that supports this massive gun control ideology, because we look at places like Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles. We have the greatest gun restrictions in those cities. However, we have the highest propensity of gun violence. But at the same token, doing nothing is worse than than doing something that has little effect. So that being said, I think that gun owners, and I hear it all the time, like we just had the NRA convention down in Texas, and you had people that got on the stage and spouted outrageous rhetoric, but you also had a lot of people like myself that said, hey, look, we need to do something because nothing being done is amounting to the greatest propensity of violence.
Is the debate changing, Darrin? I mean, when you look at, the pro-gun lobby that used to say, oh, it's not the guns, it's the people. Don't blame the guns, it's the people. It's crazy people, don't blame the Second Amendment. It's not guns, it's not guns. You think the debate is shifting now?
To a point, but I don't think much is going to happen. And I give you an example. After Sandy Hook, if you didn't make changes in gun control, I knew it was never going to happen. But I will say this, I think it's a part of the two. I agree that there's a side of it that people would mention that, look, it's not the gun, it's the person. Yes, it is the person, but at the same token, the person needs to be in possession of this firearm. So it bifurcates into two components.
Last question, and you're going to hate me for asking, but you appear on left and right-wing media, and I'm very curious because you go on CNN, which is considered left, and then you wind up, in particular, maybe sometimes on Fox News, which, where they line up on gun laws. So how do you navigate that in terms of commentary?
Very easy, very easy. And like I mentioned to you earlier, that it bifurcates into 2 points. It's many people will say it's not the gun, it's the person. And you can run somebody over with a car and kill them. So why didn't we outlaw cars? I got it. But at the same token, you need to look at what the problem is. The problem is People of an unsound mind in possession of a firearm is a double exposure to danger. So you need to focus on not just the person, but what they had to commit to these atrocities. And that's my argument on all media. And people are in wide acceptance and agreement to that. So you mentioned the New York Times article in connection with where we as common citizens stand in connection with gun control. I mentioned to you also about New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles having the tightest gun control laws, but we have the greatest propensity for violence. You need to look at both avenues. You can't spotlight just one component, because if you look at the one component, you're going to continue to have these mass shootings that have been plaguing the United States for years on end. The numbers are going up, they're not going down.
Yeah, because there's probably the numbers of crazy people who've been sitting around in the pandemic looking at fringe media and getting more and more bent out of shape mentally are going up, and firearms are just too damn available.
We have 400 million firearms in the United States. We have 360 million people that live in the United States. We got more guns than people. We're at a point now is, you have to do something. And it's just nothing is really committing to greater violence against us as common citizens.
Dr. Darrin Porcher, always a privilege to talk to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. Appreciate you. All right.
And that's our backstory this week. By the way, U.S. intelligence now says openly they believe that Putin has cancer and was treated again in April. They also say he survived an assassination attempt in March. His rule is not absolute or guaranteed. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov denies that Putin is ill or dying. He's the guy who said there would be no invasion of Ukraine, if you remember. So that's almost a confirmation that Putin is sick. What could bring about a quicker end to the war in Ukraine and lifting of sanctions on Russia than Putin's death? And maybe it could happen sooner than later. Please share this podcast, help us grow, recommend us to a friend. I'm Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.